San Dimas was one of those small towns you drive right through if you didn't know better. Nestled quietly in the rolling hills, it had that typical small-town charm. The kind that made you think of simple living, friendly neighbors, and quiet streets. The sort of place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a pace that felt almost frozen in time. The houses were cozy, and the lawns were perfectly manicured. The local diner was always bustling, with a few regulars, and the kids played outside until the streetlights flickered on. It was the kind of town where you felt safe, where the biggest worry was whether the local high school football team would win their next game. But despite the picturesque scene, there was always something unsettling about San Dimas. Something beneath the surface. At night, when the town went to sleep, strange noises would drift through the streets. The wind would whistle through the trees, rattling the branches, and every now and then, the streetlights would flicker, casting long, strange shadows on the ground. Some would say it was just the wind or a malfunction in the electrical system, but others swore that the shadows moved on their own, almost as if something was out there watching. No one talked about it openly, but the rumors were always there. Whispers in the corners of the local bar or over the fences between neighbors. People started to notice strange things. Doors left open when they were sure they'd been closed. Lights turning on by themselves, and windows left ajar with no explanation. There were strange figures seen at the edges of the woods at night, but no one dared to investigate. After all, San Dimas was supposed to be a safe place, wasn't it? But then came the murders. It started with Emily. Emily was a young woman, barely 20, with a bright future ahead of her. She worked at the local bookstore and lived in a modest home on the outskirts of town. She had been known for her friendly smile and her ability to always lend a helping hand. She was the kind of person everyone liked. That's why when she disappeared, it shocked the entire town. It wasn't like Emily to just vanish without a trace. At first, the locals thought maybe she had run off, gone to visit relatives, or taken a short trip without telling anyone. But days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of her. Then, her body was found. It was in the woods, just outside of town. At first it looked like any other corpse. Someone who had wandered off, gotten lost, maybe met with an unfortunate accident. But as the police examined the body, the horror began to unfold. Emily's body had been hidden beneath a pile of leaves, almost as if someone had taken the time to cover it up, to make sure it wasn't found right away. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost lifeless, and her eyes were wide open, frozen in a look of terror. Her body was contorted, twisted in a way that made it clear she had been running for her life before she was caught. The worst part? There were no signs of a struggle, No blood, no defensive wounds, no indication that she fought back at all. The authorities couldn't make sense of it. There were no fingerprints, no clues, no weapon found nearby. It was as if the murder had happened in the blink of an eye, and the killer had vanished into thin air. The police had no leads, no suspects, and no idea of what to even begin looking for. And so, like a terrible nightmare, the town was left to wonder who could have done such a thing, and, more terrifyingly, why. As days passed, the fear in San Dimas only grew. The town was no longer the peaceful place it once was. People began to avoid the woods, and a certain unease crept into every corner of the town. Parents kept their children inside at night, and the local diner, once filled with laughter and conversation, was now eerily quiet, with everyone too afraid to speak too loudly. But then, as if Emily's death wasn't enough to shake the town to its core, more people began to disappear. It started slowly at first, with just a few missing persons here and there. A local farmer's son who'd gone to check on the livestock and never came back. A teenage girl who'd been walking home from a friend's house and was never seen again. But as the days passed, it became clear that this wasn't some coincidence. The disappearances were linked, and they weren't just random. Each person who vanished seemed to have been taken with the same eerie precision. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle. It was as though the people simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only fear and confusion. The police were overwhelmed. The local news was full of speculation, and yet no one could offer any answers. The town was on edge, and the anxiety was palpable. Every rustling leaf, every flickering light, every unexplained noise seemed like a reminder that something was terribly wrong in San Dimas. The locals started to talk. Some believed the murders were the work of a serial killer, someone who knew the town too well, someone who was hiding in plain sight. Others whispered about something darker. They talked about a curse, an evil that had been waiting to resurface for decades, something that had always been there, lying dormant in the shadows. It was easy to dismiss these stories as superstition. After all, this was the 21st century, and no one really believed in curses or dark forces anymore. But as the disappearances continued, people began to wonder if the stories were more than just folklore. Was it possible that something ancient and malevolent had taken hold of San Dimas? Was there a force out there, something beyond human understanding, that was pulling the strings? The town grew more paranoid by the day. People began to lock their doors at night, and whispers filled the streets. Everyone became a suspect. Friends turned on friends. Neighbors became wary of each other, wondering if the person next door could be the killer. Some even suggested, that one of the missing townspeople had returned, somehow twisted by whatever evil force had come to claim them. But there was no proof, no concrete answers. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, San Dimas became a town of fear. People avoided talking about the murders, but the fear hung in the air, thick and suffocating. No one was safe, and the worst part was that no one knew who was next. The murders of San Dimas were unsolved. The killer, or whatever it was, remained out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next victim. And with every passing day, the hope for answers grew dimmer. What was happening in San Dimas? Who or what was behind the horrific deaths? And would the town ever be the same again? It wasn't just a series of murders anymore. It was a nightmare that no one could wake up from. And the terror was just beginning. The rumors spread quickly, whispering through the streets of San Dimas like wildfire, leaving behind a trail of fear and uncertainty. At first, they were nothing more than idle chatter, stories shared over fences or in hushed voices at the local diner. But as time went on, the stories grew darker, more unsettling. People started saying that something was watching them in the woods. It wasn't just the usual sounds of nature you'd expect. No, this was different. People spoke of shadows that moved in ways they couldn't explain. At night, if you ventured too far into the woods, you could feel eyes on your back. An overwhelming sense that something was following you, waiting for you to make a mistake. Yet whenever they turned around, nothing was ever there. Just the trees, the silence, and the weight of the unknown pressing in on them. As the tales spread, the once peaceful woods surrounding San Dimas became a place of fear. No one dared venture into the forest after dark anymore. And those who had lived there their whole lives began to avoid the area altogether. The woods, which had once been a place to hike or gather firewood, were now seen as something to be feared, something that held a dark secret no one could explain. But of course, as it often happens with rumors, there were those who didn't believe. There were always skeptics, always people who thought the stories were just exaggerated or the result of overactive imaginations. A group of teens, including Jason, Sarah, and Mark, were among them. They'd grown up hearing these stories all their lives, but had never seen anything to make them believe the woods were anything but just woods. Sure, there were a few strange things that had happened here and there, but they were dismissing it as nothing more than coincidence. There was no reason to believe that anything sinister lurked in those trees. One evening, fueled by a mix of boredom and curiosity, they made a pact to prove the rumors wrong. Armed with nothing but their flashlights, some snacks, and a couple of cans of soda, they set out to walk deeper into the woods than anyone had dared to go in years. The plan was simple. Walk through the trees, take some pictures, and see if they could find any evidence of the so-called shadows that the townsfolk spoke of. They laughed at the idea, thinking of it as nothing more than an overblown tale. The deeper they walked into the forest, however, the more the atmosphere began to change. It started with the air. At first, it was cool, refreshing even, as the evening breeze brushed past them. But as they ventured further, the air grew heavier. It wasn't humid or warm, just dense and thick, almost as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. The trees seemed to close in around them, their towering trunks and thick canopies shutting out the last remnants of sunlight. There was a strange stillness in the air now. The usual sounds of the woods, rustling leaves, chirping insects, the distant call of a bird, were all gone. It was unnerving. The silence felt unnatural, like something was intentionally suppressing any noise. Jason, the most skeptical of them all, kept cracking jokes, trying to ease the tension. I swear, this is the part of the movie where the creepy music starts and someone gets grabbed by a ghost, he joked, flashing his flashlight around. Mark, trying to seem unbothered, nodded in agreement, but even he couldn't deny the unease creeping in. It wasn't just that the woods felt different. It was the sensation that something wasn't right. Something was watching them from beyond the trees. They pushed on, determined to prove they were just overthinking it. But every step further into the woods only seemed to intensify the feeling. The trees, now towering over them, cast strange, twisted shadows that seemed to move and shift with each passing moment, even though there was no breeze to move them. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching them. The hair on the back of Sarah's neck stood up. She tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. Jason's jokes faltered as the darkness grew deeper around them. "All right, guys," he said, his voice suddenly losing its bravado. "Let's turn back. I think we've seen enough." But just as they were about to turn around and head back, the air seemed to grow colder. And that's when they all heard it. A rustling in the bushes just ahead. Mark froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Jason turned his flashlight towards the noise, but when they looked, there was nothing there. No animal, no movement. Just the shadows stretching longer with each passing second. "Probably just a raccoon or something," Jason said, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. He had begun to feel it too now. the nagging sensation that they weren't alone, that something in the forest was aware of them, moving closer. And then the scream. It came from Jason, high-pitched and filled with pure terror. He dropped his flashlight, the beam dancing wildly across the trees before it fell still. The others whipped around, fear gripping them as they saw Jason standing stock still, his face pale, his body rigid. He was pointing towards something in the distance, his eyes wide with fear. They followed his gaze, and there, standing just beyond the trees, was a figure. Tall, dark, and motionless, stood in the clearing, its outline obscured by the shadow of the forest. Its shape was barely visible, but its presence was unmistakable. It was watching them. Mark's heart raced. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Sarah took a step forward, her breath caught in her throat. What is that?" she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring, unblinking, its silhouette almost blending into the darkness. The only thing that set it apart was its unnatural height. The teens couldn't make out any details. No face, no clothing, no sign of life, just the eerie, unblinking presence of something that shouldn't be there. Jason took a step back, his flashlight trembling in his hands. "Let's go," he said, his voice shaky. Now, they all turned to run, but the woods were no longer the familiar path they had once known. It was as if the trees themselves were shifting, twisting around them, forcing them deeper into the forest. No matter how much they tried to run in the direction they thought was the way out, they ended up back at the same spot. The clearing, the figure still standing there, unmoving. It was as if the woods had become a maze, a trap. Panic set in. They ran in every direction, heartbeats thundering in their ears. But every time they tried to find a way out, the trees seemed to close in tighter. Their flashlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, as if the very darkness itself was alive, hunting them. That's when they realized something far worse than the figure was waiting for them. They weren't just lost in the woods. They weren't alone. Something unseen was out there, moving with them, watching them. The figure was no longer the only thing to fear. The entire forest had become a living, breathing thing. And it was closing in around them. And no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape. The Hollow. That was the name the locals gave to the old house on the outskirts of San Dimas. The place had been abandoned for years, long before Sarah had even been born. No one remembered the last time it had been lived in, but it was well known in the town as a cursed place. There was a strange aura about it, one that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up the moment you got close. For years, people had avoided it. The windows were boarded up, the lawn overgrown with weeds, and the air around it always seemed to be thick with an unnatural stillness. The house stood, as if forgotten by time, looming in the distance like some kind of warning, yet no one dared get too close. But as the murder investigation grew colder, Sarah knew that the hollow might hold the answers she was desperately seeking. Her brother had been one of the first to disappear, and his body had been found in the woods, his face twisted in horror. The police had no leads, no clues, just an unsettling trail of fear that led nowhere. Sarah couldn't just sit back and wait for answers. She had to find out what was really going on. She had heard the stories from the town's elders, the ones who spoke of the house's dark past, about strange lights flickering in the windows, about the eerie whispers that sometimes echoed from within its walls. But none of it seemed real. Not until now. Determined, Sarah grabbed her flashlight, a camera, and a sense of resolve she didn't quite feel, but forced herself to embrace. If there was any chance of uncovering the truth, she had to do this. She knew the risks. She had heard the rumors, the stories of people who ventured too far into the house, never to return. But she was no longer afraid. Not of the house, not of the dark, not of anything. She had to find her brother's killer, and this old, decaying house was the only lead she had left. The drive to the hollow was uneventful. The road leading out to the outskirts of town, eerily quiet, as Sarah's headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the overgrown path to the house. As she approached the crumbling structure, she couldn't help but feel an uneasy knot tighten in her stomach. The house looked worse than she remembered from her childhood. A dark silhouette against the night sky, with broken windows and a dilapidated porch. She could see that the door was slightly ajar, as if it were waiting for her. She parked her car a little way down the road and stepped out, the cool night air hitting her face. The woods behind her seemed alive with the sound of rustling leaves, but the house, it was completely silent. As Sarah stepped closer to the house, her flashlight cast long shadows across the cracked stones of the walkway, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The house seemed to loom over her, its walls sagging, as if burdened with the weight of its history. She took a deep breath and pushed open the door, which creaked loudly in protest as it swung inward. The smell of decay hit her immediately, musty and foul, as if the house had been closed off from the world for far too long. The air inside was stale, and as Sarah moved deeper into the house, the floorboards creaked under her weight. Dust particles floated in the beam of her flashlight, making the air feel thick and heavy. She paused, taking in her surroundings. The house was as she had imagined, worn down, neglected, and eerie. But there was something else, something that made her skin crawl. She noticed footprints in the thick dust on the floor. It was odd. These were fresh footprints. She had been told no one had lived in this house for years, but these prints were deep and unmistakable, as though someone had recently walked through. Her heart began to race as she stepped further into the house. The walls were lined with old portraits, their faces blurred by age, and peeling wallpaper hung loosely, like the house was shedding its skin. The whispers that had been nothing more than rumors were now starting to feel real. She couldn't tell where they were coming from, whether they were in her mind or carried on the air. But the sound of hushed voices was unmistakable. It made her uneasy, but she pressed on. The house seemed to stretch forever, each room darker than the last, filled with shadows that didn't seem to make sense. It was as though the darkness was thicker here than anywhere else. She kept her camera rolling, recording every step, her breath shaky as she entered another room. The whispers grew louder, like a chorus of low murmurs. But when she shone her flashlight in the direction of the sound, there was nothing, just empty rooms. When Sarah reached the staircase that led to the second floor, she stopped. The air had grown colder, and she could see her breath misting in front of her. She looked at the stairs, and then back at the shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls. But something pushed her forward. There was a sound from above, a noise that echoed from the attic. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make her freeze in place. The hairs on her neck stood up as she listened. It was the sound of something moving, slowly, deliberately, something that didn't belong in this house. With her heart pounding, Sarah moved up the stairs, the old wood creaking under her feet with each step. The temperature dropped as she reached the top, and she could see her breath misting in the air. The attic door stood slightly ajar, and the whispers were louder now, echoing from behind it. Sarah reached for the door and pushed it open, her flashlight cutting through the darkness beyond. What she saw made her freeze. The attic was empty, save for one thing. The walls were covered in strange symbols. Symbols she recognized from the murder investigations. They were scrawled hastily in what appeared to be blood, their jagged lines twisting and curling into shapes that made no sense. Sarah's stomach turned as she stepped closer, the faint light from her flashlight flickering across the symbols. She recognized them immediately from the files she had read. Symbols tied to the victims, tied to the murders. The air grew thicker, colder, as the whispers rose to a deafening pitch. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as she turned around, But before she could move, a cold hand grabbed her ankle. It felt like ice, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. She screamed and tried to pull away, but the grip was unyielding. She stumbled backward, her camera falling from her hand, still recording as it hit the floor. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the last thing she saw before the world went dark was a shadow moving in the corner of her vision, tall and looming. The footage cut out abruptly, leaving nothing but static. Sarah's screams, however, echoed in the silence of the empty house. What had happened to her? What had she discovered that was so dangerous? The camera was still on, recording the darkness, but the answers were lost, swallowed by the house, and by whatever was lurking within its walls. The town of San Dimas had descended into complete chaos. It had always been a quiet, peaceful place where everyone knew each other by name, and life moved at a slow, almost idyllic pace. But now, fear gripped every corner of the town. The murders had become a regular occurrence, and each new death seemed to bring with it a fresh wave of horror. People were disappearing, only to be found later, their bodies grotesquely contorted, their faces twisted in expressions of terror. The townspeople couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Something beyond human comprehension. As the body count rose, so did the sense of dread. The police, who were once the backbone of the community, were no longer able to offer any comfort. They were stumped, completely at a loss as to how to proceed. There were no witnesses, no forensic evidence, and no suspects. It was as if the killer, if it was a killer, had vanished into thin air after each gruesome act. Every time a new body was discovered, the police were left to comb through the scene, only to find more questions than answers. It was maddening. How could a murderer slip through their grasp every time? And what was the motive? Was this the work of a sadistic serial killer? Or was there something far more sinister at play? As the weeks passed, the whispers grew louder. People began to speculate, offering their own theories and experiences. Some were convinced that there was a serial killer stalking the town, someone who had carefully planned each murder, leaving nothing behind but death and fear. But others, who had begun to hear strange stories of their own, were starting to think it wasn't so simple. It was as though an invisible force was at work, guiding the hand of whoever or whatever was responsible for the killings. The more people spoke about it, the more the sense of dread grew. There were too many unexplainable things happening for it to be just the work of a human mind. Mike, a local farmer, was one of the first to speak out about what he had seen. He was well known around town, a reliable figure who had lived in San Dimas his entire life. One evening, as he was walking back to his barn, he had seen a tall man standing by the edge of the woods. The man was cloaked in shadow, his face obscured by a dark mask, so Mike couldn't make out any details. At first, he thought it was just another passerby, someone out for a walk, but something about the figure unnerved him. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He was simply standing there, watching Mike with a stillness that felt unnatural. Mike had tried to approach, calling out to the figure, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned and disappeared into the thick fog that had settled over the woods. Mike had hurried back to his house, his heart racing, unsure of what he had just witnessed. Was it the killer? Or was it something else? He had no answers, only the unsettling feeling that something had been watching him, waiting for him to get too close. Soon, others began to share their own experiences. Emma, a local waitress, came forward with a chilling tale. One night, as she walked home from work, she had seen a man near the woods, standing motionless under the full moon. She didn't get a good look at him either, but something about the way he stood there, so still, so lifeless, made her feel like she was in the presence of something otherworldly. Her blood ran cold as she recalled how, just as she was about to turn away, the man seemed to vanish, melting into the shadows like he had never been there. Her encounter wasn't as close as Mike's, but it left her shaken to the core. She couldn't stop thinking about it. As more people came forward with their own stories, a pattern began to emerge. Each one described the same thing. A tall man, his face hidden behind a mask, standing motionless, watching from the shadows. The figure seemed to appear out of nowhere and then just as quickly vanish into thin air. It was as though he didn't belong to this world at all, like he was a part of something much darker. Some even began to question if the killer was human at all. The way he moved, the way he disappeared, the way he seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. It was all too unnatural. People were starting to believe that the town's nightmare wasn't just the work of a killer. It was something far more ancient, something that had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The rumors began to spread about the Hollow, the abandoned house on the outskirts of town. It had always been a source of local superstition, with the older generation recalling strange events tied to the house. Some said that it had once belonged to a wealthy family who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Others whispered about the strange symbols that had been found etched into the walls. But now, with the killings growing more gruesome by the day, people were starting to connect the dots. Some believed that whatever or whoever was causing the deaths was somehow tied to the house, that the old place held the key to understanding the terror that had befallen the town. It wasn't just the physical appearance of the hollow that caused fear. It was the way it felt. Standing at its edge, people spoke of an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the house itself were alive, watching you, waiting for you to step closer. It was as though something dark and malevolent had taken root in the house, and now it was spreading outward, reaching into the town itself. The more people spoke of it, the more the idea took hold. The Hollow wasn't just a house. It was a gateway, a door to something ancient, something cursed. Some even began to say that the killer wasn't just a man. He was a manifestation of that curse, an entity that had taken human form, brought to life by the dark forces that had haunted San Dimas for generations. They spoke of a curse that had been buried long ago, something tied to the land, to the house, to the town itself. It had been waiting for the right time to rise again. And now, with the murders, it was finally free. The fear was palpable. People were locking their doors at night, staying in their homes, afraid to venture out after dark. No one knew who to trust anymore. Everyone was a suspect. Neighbors became strangers, and once friendly faces turned cold and suspicious. In every corner of the town, there was a sense of unease, an undercurrent of panic that refused to go away. As the days passed, the town's search for answers grew more desperate. The police had no leads, no clues, just a string of bodies and an ever-growing list of suspects. The people of San Dimas were left to rely on the whispers and rumors that had begun to take on a life of their own. Was the killer human, or was there something far more sinister behind the deaths? And if it was something supernatural, what did it want? Was it seeking revenge, or was it simply feeding on the fear it had created? The darkness seemed to be closing in around them, and as each new victim fell, the people of San Dimas couldn't help but wonder, could they stop it before it consumed them all? Or was the town already doomed, cursed to repeat the horrors of its past? There were no answers, only more questions, and with each unanswered question, the terror grew. The survivors had gathered in the heart of the town, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. There was no more hope in waiting for the police, no more faith in the idea that someone else could solve the mystery that had consumed San Dimas. The killer, or whatever it was, had terrorized their town long enough. The killings had become more frequent, more brutal, and the once peaceful streets were now drenched in a palpable sense of dread. The group knew what they had to do. It was time to confront whatever was responsible for the deaths that had shattered their lives. The Hollow, the cursed house on the outskirts of town, was the key. It had always been the key, and now, with nowhere else to turn, they decided to face the darkness head-on. Sarah was among them, her heart heavy with the weight of the loss she had endured. The memory of her brother's death still haunted her every waking moment, and the feeling of helplessness was something she could no longer bear. She wasn't alone in her grief. Jason, Mark, Emma, and a few others, all survivors in their own right, stood by her side. They were all haunted by the same terror, and together they vowed to end it. They weren't sure if they would live to see the dawn, but they had to try. The fate of their town, their lives, and their sanity depended on it. They entered the hollow as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown path leading up to the house. The structure loomed ahead, its windows like empty eyes staring into their souls. The air felt thick with unease, and every step closer to the house made their hearts race faster. They had all heard the stories, the whispers, the sightings of the tall man with the mask, the feeling of being watched. But now it was no longer a story. It was real, and it was waiting for them. Inside, the house was as they remembered it from the stories, its dust-covered furniture and rotting wood giving off an almost oppressive atmosphere. The air smelled stale, tinged with the scent of decay, as if the house itself had been abandoned for far longer than anyone could fathom. But there was no time for hesitation. They moved cautiously through the darkened rooms, flashlights in hand, their nerves frayed, but their resolve unbroken. The sound of their footsteps echoed unnervingly through the house, and the deeper they ventured, the more oppressive the air became. The walls seemed to close in on them, the silence broken only by their hurried breaths and the occasional creak of the floorboards. As they moved from room to room, the whispering began. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. But as they continued, the voices grew louder, clearer, as though the very walls were alive, speaking to them in tongues they could not understand. It was as though the house itself was aware of their presence, watching them, waiting. They searched each room, determined to find the source of the terror. But no matter how hard they looked, there was no sign of the figure they had come to confront. No tall, masked man, no monstrous presence lurking in the shadows. Just the house, empty, silent. But the whispers, they didn't stop. They only grew louder, more insistent. The group exchanged uneasy glances, wondering if they had made a mistake. But they couldn't turn back now. They had come this far, and they would face whatever nightmare awaited them, no matter the cost. It happened suddenly, without warning. As they made their way into a large room at the center of the house, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash. The sound echoed throughout the house, and the group froze in place, their hearts hammering in their chests. They tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. Panic surged through them as they realized they had no way out. The house had become their prison. And then, just as the realization of their situation sank in, the figure appeared. It was tall, taller than any man they had ever seen, and its presence filled the room with an unnatural chill. Its face was hidden behind a mask, smooth, featureless, cold. The eyes behind the mask were empty, as though they had never known warmth, never known life. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its form barely visible, but menacing all the same. It didn't speak. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching them with a gaze that pierced through the very air around them. The group tensed, fear bubbling up inside them. They had expected something like this, but the reality was far worse than anything they had imagined. The whispers, now louder than ever, seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding them, drowning them in their own terror. The figure moved, slowly at first, but then with terrifying speed. It darted toward them like a shadow, a blur of motion that didn't make sense. Sarah screamed as the figure reached out, its hand like ice, its grip unyielding. She struggled, but the strength of the creature was beyond human comprehension. The others tried to fight back, each one swinging whatever they had. Flashlights, baseball bats, kitchen knives, at the dark figure, but it was no use. The blows seemed to have no effect. The creature didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice. It moved with a predatory grace, as though it was toying with them, savoring their fear. One by one, they were dragged into the darkness. Jason was the first to go. He fought like a man possessed, but his strength was no match for the figure. The creature's hand wrapped around his throat, and with a single, fluid motion, it pulled him into the shadows. His screams echoed in the room before they were silenced. Mark was next. He tried to protect Emma, pushing her out of harm's way, but in the blink of an eye, the figure lunged at him, its cold hands grabbing him by the shoulders, pulling him into the darkness. Emma tried to follow, tried to save them, but she too was caught. The figure's grip was like ice, and it pulled her into the dark void with a force she couldn't resist. A last thing Sarah saw before the world went black was the mask. The cold, expressionless mask staring back at her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breath came in shallow gasps as she struggled against the darkness. She could hear the whispers now, louder than ever, swirling around her like a storm. They were everywhere, in her head, in her ears, in her soul. And then everything went still. When the police finally arrived, hours later, they found the hollow empty. No sign of the survivors, no trace of the creature, just the house, silent, watching. The doors were wide open, as if inviting them in, but inside there was nothing. No bodies, no evidence, just the lingering, oppressive darkness that seemed to hang in the air, as though the house itself was waiting for someone else to come, to confront the terror, to become part of its story. The search for answers continued, but the town of San Dimas was never the same again. The memories of that night, the final stand against the darkness, haunted those who were left behind. The killing stopped, but the fear never did. The hollow remained, standing silent and empty on the outskirts of town, waiting for the next group of fools brave enough to enter, waiting for the next chapter in the nightmare that had been born from the shadows. The murders in San Dimas stopped, but the scars they left behind ran deep, etched into the very fabric of the town. The peace that had once defined the small community was shattered, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread that hung in the air like a thick fog. The survivors, those few who had managed to escape the clutches of whatever evil had plagued their town, lived in a state of constant fear. Their minds were haunted by the horrors they had witnessed, and their nights were filled with restless sleep, the images of masked figures and shadows lurking just beyond their reach. The hollow, the cursed house on the outskirts of town, was sealed off. The police had placed heavy locks on the doors, and the windows were boarded up, as if to contain the darkness that had once poured out of it. But even as they tried to shut it away, there was an undeniable sense that something far worse than just a house had been left behind. The legacy of the hollow and the terror it had unleashed was something that could not be contained by walls or locks. The very essence of fear had taken root in the town, and no matter how much they tried to forget, it was always there, lurking in the background. The case was officially closed. The police had combed through every inch of evidence, spoken to every witness, and yet no one had been able to answer the most crucial question: who or what was behind the killings? The tall, masked figure that had stalked the streets, dragging its victims into the shadows, had never been found. Some believed it was a man, a human murderer who had slipped away unnoticed. Others thought it was something far more sinister, a creature born of darkness, one that fed on fear and left nothing but death in its wake. Whatever it was, it had vanished, leaving behind only confusion and a trail of unanswered questions. The police, exhausted by the lack of progress, had no choice but to close the case. But the townspeople knew better. They could feel it, the darkness that lingered in the corners, waiting for the right moment to return. The rumors began almost immediately after the murder stopped. At first, they were small whispers, shared between friends, stories told in hushed tones at the local diner. But as the years went by, the whispers grew louder, spreading like wildfire through the town. People claimed that if you stood near the hollow on a moonless night, you could still hear the whispers that had once filled the house. They said the house was alive, that it had tasted the fear of so many and now craved more. Some said they had seen figures moving inside the boarded-up windows, shadows shifting in the dark, but no one ever dared to go near it again. The fear of what might still be inside was too great. Even those who had once been brave enough to face the unknown were now too afraid to speak of it. As for the survivors, they carried the weight of the past with them, each one of them forever marked by what they had witnessed. Some had moved away, trying to escape the memories that plagued them, but it was impossible to outrun what had happened in San Dimas. They couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness they had faced had followed them, no matter where they went. Others stayed behind, too afraid to leave, but even they couldn't find peace. They were constantly looking over their shoulders, hearing things in the dark, seeing shapes in the corner of their vision. They had survived, but in a way, they had never truly escaped. Sarah, one of the last to leave the house that night, had become a shell of the person she once was. The fear that had consumed her in the hollow had never left her. The memories of her friends being dragged into the darkness, of the cold hand that had reached for her, still haunted her. She couldn't forget the mask, the empty eyes that had stared at her with such coldness, as if it knew everything about her, as if it had been waiting for her. She tried to move on, to rebuild her life, but no matter how hard she tried, the town of San Dimas and the horrors that lived within it wouldn't let her go. She would never be free. As time went on, the town began to change. New families moved in, unaware of the dark history that had shaped San Dimas. The houses were rebuilt, the streets repaved, and life seemed to return to normal. But even as the town grew, there was always that sense of something not quite right. The people who had lived there long enough knew better than to ignore the unease that never quite went away. It was in the way the wind howled through the trees at night, in the way the lights flickered on the outskirts of town, and in the silence that seemed to follow the residents wherever they went. It was as if the town itself had been forever marked by the events that had taken place, and the scars of that time would never fully heal. And so, San Dimas continued, haunted by its past, trapped in a cycle of fear that no one could escape. The killings had stopped, but the legacy of what had happened lingered, a dark shadow that loomed over everything. The house at the edge of town stood as a silent monument to the terror that had once gripped the town, a reminder that some stories don't end, they just wait. Wait for someone to come along, someone to listen, and someone to stir the darkness that still resides within. The survivors, though scattered and broken, shared one thing in common: they would never forget. They knew that the truth was still out there, buried beneath the walls of the hollow, hidden in the whispers that could still be heard in the dead of night. They knew that one day, someone would uncover the secrets of the past, and when they did, the darkness would rise once more. Some stories, the survivors would tell you, don't have a clear ending. They just wait, waiting for the right moment to be told. And San Dimas, it was always waiting, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen, to uncover the truth, to face the darkness that had never truly gone away. And when that moment came, the town would be ready. Because the legacy of San Dimas was not just the murders, the killings, the horrors. It was the fear. And fear never truly dies. It waits. And in the case of San Dimas, it was waiting for the next chapter, the next victim, the next fool, and no one would be safe when it returned.